In 1848, two teenage girls in upstate New York claimed they could speak to the dead. They called it communication. The public called it proof. By tapping on walls and floors, the Fox sisters ignited a movement that would spread across America and Europe. Séances became respectable. Mediums became professionals. The supernatural gained a language people trusted. But beneath the candles and whispers, something else was forming. A market. For the first time, fear itself could be organized, explained, and sold. This mattered because belief does not stay in parlors. It follows money. Spiritualism did more than normalize ghosts. It normalized the idea that unseen forces could inhabit ordinary spaces. Homes, rooms, stairwells. And once a house could be occupied by something invisible, it could be transformed without changing a single brick. A rumor could lower its value. A séance could stigmatize it. A story could make it undesirable. This was the opening. In the mid-19th century, cities were expanding rapidly. Large homes were being inherited, subdivided, or abandoned. Some were difficult to sell. Others were financially inconvenient. And in that pressure, a question emerged. What if a haunting could be created on purpose? Not to contact the dead, but to move property. Spiritualism provided the cover. The architecture provided the tools, and human fear provided the fuel. A house did not need to be destroyed to lose its value. It only needed a story attached to it. Once a home was known as troubled, buyers hesitated, neighbors whispered, prices fell quietly, and someone was always ready to buy it cheap. This was not folklore, it was strategy. Mediums were paid, rumors were seeded, sounds were engineered. Newspapers amplified what could not be verified. The haunted house scam was not an accident of belief, it was a system. A way to turn superstition into leverage, and leverage into profit. This documentary is not about whether ghosts exist. It is about how fear was engineered, monetized, and written into deeds. Because once fear can be attached to property, ownership changes meaning, and the house is never just a house again. In the next part, we examine the physical mechanics behind the scam, not the spirits, but the walls that made them believable. The perfect haunted house was not built by ghosts, it was built by carpenters. Long before hauntings became rumors, they were design features. Victorian homes were complex by necessity. Large households required servant corridors, back staircases, and hidden passages. Walls were thick, ceilings were hollow, sound traveled in unpredictable ways. These features were practical. They were also exploitable. Speaking tubes carried whispers from one room to another. Ventilation shafts amplified knocks and taps. Loose floorboards creaked under slight pressure. Hollow walls turned footsteps into movement. None of this was supernatural, but it felt like it. In gas-lit interiors, shadows behaved strangely. Flickering light distorted depth and motion. Rooms appeared occupied even when empty. Architects did not design these homes to deceive, but once the belief system existed, the buildings did the work. A knock heard through a wall did not need an explanation. It already had one. Scammers learned quickly which houses worked best. Multi-story homes, narrow stairwells, old plumbing, shared walls. The more complex the layout, the easier it was to stage presence. A sound could be placed without a source. A draft could be mistaken for movement. A vibration could feel intentional. These houses did not need modification. They needed suggestion. Once a medium declared a space active, Every flaw became evidence. Every noise confirmed the story. Buyers stopped evaluating the structure. They evaluated the threat. This is the key transition. The building ceased to be real estate. It became a narrative container. And narratives are cheaper to manipulate than materials. In the next part, we examine the first known moment this system was used deliberately, not by believers, but by investors. In the 1880s, a prominent mansion in Cincinnati became difficult to sell. The house was large, well-built, and increasingly inconvenient. Maintenance costs were high. The neighborhood was changing. Potential buyers hesitated. Then, the haunting began. It did not start with screams or apparitions. It started with a dinner party. Neighbors were invited. A respected medium was present. The atmosphere was controlled. During the evening, the medium announced a presence, a restless spirit tied to the home's past, a widow who had died within its walls. The details were specific enough to feel authentic, but vague enough to avoid verification. Sounds followed, a knock from above, a faint movement near the stairwell. Guests reacted exactly as expected. By the end of the night, the house had a reputation. Within weeks, the story spread. Local papers mentioned the disturbance. Whispers replaced listings. The property's value dropped sharply. Only then did the original owners sell, quietly, at a loss. The buyers were connected to the same consortium that had hosted the dinner party. Once the house changed hands, the activity stopped. No séances, no sounds, no stories. The home was cleansed. Repairs were made. The listing returned. Months later, the mansion sold again, at nearly 3 times the previous price. No ghost followed the deed. This was not a hoax driven by belief. It was an operation driven by timing. A medium was paid. A narrative was seeded. The market reacted. The house itself never changed. Only the story attached to it did. This is one of the earliest documented cases of fear being used as leverage in real estate, not to sell a fantasy, but to create a discount. In the next part, we examine the people who made this possible, the mediums who turned belief into income. The haunted house scam did not work without specialists, not builders, not lawyers, but intermediaries. The medium was the scam's operational core. By the late 19th century, professional psychics were common. They advertised openly. They charged fees. They traveled between cities. Some believed their own claims. Others treated spiritualism as performance. For scammers, that distinction did not matter. What mattered was credibility. A medium did not need proof. They needed presence. They arrived with reputation already established. Neighbors recognized their name. Newspapers had printed their predictions before. This authority did the work. Mediums used techniques that required no supernatural ability: cold reading, observation, careful listening. They gathered information in advance: property histories, local tragedies, family rumors. Every detail became material. During a séance, nothing was invented. It was rearranged. A death became a restless spirit. An illness became unfinished business. A renovation accident became a warning sign. The medium framed the house as sensitive, reactive, easily disturbed. Once declared, the label was difficult to remove. Mediums rarely accused owners directly. They spoke cautiously. They warned of residual energy, of unsettled presences, of echoes. This language was deliberate. It created fear without making claims that could be disproven, and it protected the medium legally. In many cases, payment was indirect: a séance fee, a consultation charge, a donation. In others, the medium received a percentage of the transaction, paid quietly, unrecorded. The relationship was transactional. The medium lowered the value, the buyer capitalized on it, the medium moved on. When the house changed hands, the haunting often ended. No spirits followed the new owner, no disturbances remained. The explanation was always the same. The energy had been released, the spirit had moved on, the house was at peace. The medium's job was complete. This created a closed loop. Fear was introduced, value dropped, ownership changed, fear disappeared. To outside observers, it looked like resolution. To the participants, it was success. Mediums were not lone fraudsters operating in isolation. They were contractors, hired for a specific phase of the process, removed once the objective was achieved. They provided plausible deniability. If questioned, they claimed belief. If challenged, they cited experience. If sued, they invoked opinion. The scam did not depend on deception alone. It depended on social permission. Spiritualism provided that permission. It allowed fear to be discussed openly, without shame, without skepticism. And once fear could be spoken aloud, it could be weaponized. In the next part, we shift perspective, because the most important question is not who performed the scam, it is why so many people believed it worked. The haunted house scam did not rely on ignorance. It relied on normal human perception. Most victims were not gullible. They were attentive, they were observant, and they were already primed. 19th century homes were quiet in unfamiliar ways. Gaslighting altered depth and shadow. Sound behaved unpredictably in enclosed spaces. The human brain fills gaps quickly. A faint noise becomes a pattern becomes intention becomes presence. This process has a name, auditory pareidolia, the tendency to hear meaning in random sound. Dripping water becomes footsteps, settling wood becomes movement, air pressure becomes breath. Once a person expects a cause, their perception reorganizes to confirm it. Another factor was infrasound. Low-frequency vibrations, often produced by wind, old pipes, or large mechanical systems, can induce anxiety, dread, and a feeling of being watched. People do not identify infrasound as sound, they experience it as emotion. Unease without explanation feels external, it feels imposed. In gas-lit rooms, this effect intensified. Lighting flickered, shadows shifted subtly, depth cues were unreliable. The brain compensated by inventing coherence. Add suggestion and the effect multiplied. Once a medium labeled a house as active, residents began monitoring their environment differently. They listened harder, they noticed more, they remembered selectively. Neutral events became evidence. This is confirmation bias operating under stress. Diary entries from the period show the pattern clearly. Residents recorded sounds after being warned, not before. Fear did not create the environment, it reorganized attention. Another powerful force was social reinforcement. Once a haunting was discussed openly, disbelief became socially risky. To question the claim was to question neighbors, to appear insensitive or arrogant. Silence became agreement. In this context, belief was not an error, it was adaptive behavior. People trusted social consensus. They trusted authority figures. They trusted their own census. All three were compromised simultaneously. The scam did not need to convince everyone. It only needed to create enough doubt to lower value. Once buyers hesitated, the market responded. No confrontation was required. No proof was necessary. Fear does not demand certainty, only plausibility. And plausibility was abundant. This is why haunted house scams worked repeatedly. They did not fight reason. They bypassed it. They transformed ordinary perception into liability. In the next part, we examine how this private fear became public knowledge, because a haunting does not become profitable until it is reported.
A haunted house did not become valuable to scammers until other people heard about it. Private fear lowered comfort. Public fear lowered prices. In the late 19th century, the penny press transformed rumor into reach. Cheap newspapers competed for attention. Sensational stories sold copies. Verification was optional. A haunting was perfect content. It was dramatic, it was local, and it could not be easily disproven. Reporters rarely investigated claims of supernatural activity. They repeated them. Articles described unexplained sounds. Witness accounts were quoted without challenge. Language was cautious but suggestive. Words like disturbance, phenomenon, and mystery appeared often. This framing mattered. It implied uncertainty, not falsehood, and uncertainty invites imagination. Once a paper mentioned a house, neighbors repeated the story. Real estate agents heard it. Prospective buyers searched for it. The stigma detached from the source and attached to the address. In some cases, reporters were manipulated. A tip was planted. A medium was introduced as a local expert. Access was exchanged for amplification. In other cases, papers acted independently. The incentive was structural. A haunted house story cost nothing to print and carried no legal risk. If it was wrong, it was rumor. If it was right, it was revelation. Either way, the paper profited. This created a feedback loop. Media coverage increased attention. Attention increased belief. Belief increased fear. Fear lowered property value. The original source of the story no longer mattered. Once published, the haunting became part of the public record. Clippings were saved. References were repeated. Future articles cited earlier ones. The story acquired permanence. This is how a temporary performance became a lasting liability. Even when activity stopped, the archive remained. Years later, buyers encountered the house through headlines, not inspections. The structure was sound, the paperwork was clean, but the reputation was damaged. The media did not need to invent ghosts, they needed to circulate them, and circulation was enough. In the next part, we examine why this worked legally. Because fear alone does not sustain a scam, it requires protection, and for decades, the law provided it. The law did not see a haunting, it saw a transaction. For most of the 19th century, property sales were governed by a single principle, caveat emptor, buyer beware. If a house was standing, the seller had fulfilled their obligation. A creaking floor was not a defect, a rumor was not evidence, and a ghost was not measurable. Courts focused on structure, walls, roofs, foundations. Fear did not qualify. When buyers tried to sue, judges asked practical questions. Was the deed valid? Was the title clear? Was the price agreed upon? If the answer was yes, the case ended. The buyer had inspected the property, the buyer had signed willingly, the buyer had accepted the risk. This legal framing created a loophole large enough to exploit. Sellers were not required to disclose rumors. They were not obligated to address stigma. They could remain silent. Silence became strategy. A house could be widely known as troubled, yet legally pristine. And once a belief was circulating publicly, no individual could be held responsible for it. This was the scam's greatest shield. Fear moved faster than liability. In several early cases, buyers argued deception. They claimed sellers knew about disturbances, that they withheld information, that the sale was made in bad faith. The courts disagreed.
Belief was subjective. The law required objectivity. A haunting could not be proven false, but it also could not be proven true, so it was ignored. This created a paradox. The more famous the haunting, the less legally relevant it became. Newspapers could report it, neighbors could repeat it, mediums could confirm it, and sellers could deny responsibility. The legal system treated fear as a personal interpretation, not a material fact. That distinction mattered. It allowed stigma to exist without accountability, and it allowed value to collapse without cause. Investors understood this quickly. As long as the structure was sound and the paperwork complete, everything else was someone else's problem. The law did not punish the creation of fear, it absorbed it. This is why the haunted house scam persisted, not because courts were corrupt, but because the system was never designed to handle belief, and belief had become currency. As the 19th century ended, this loophole did not close, it expanded, because belief was no longer confined to parlors and newspapers. It was about to be industrialized.
In California, one house refused to behave like the others. Construction never stopped. Rooms multiplied. Stairs led nowhere. Doors opened into walls. The Winchester house became famous for its excess and infamous for its explanation. Sarah Winchester, heiress to a firearms fortune, was said to believe she was haunted by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles. The story is familiar. She built to appease them. She built to confuse them. She built to survive. But the structure tells a different story. The house was not chaotic by accident. It was incremental, reactive, and always under construction. For decades, teams of carpenters, masons, and architects were employed continuously. Plans changed daily. Materials were ordered without constraint. Invoices were paid without scrutiny. There was no fixed blueprint, only motion. This created a perfect economic environment. Contractors never finished. Architects never closed a phase. Work continued because it was never declared complete. The belief sustained the system. Whether Winchester believed the spirits were real is unknowable. What is knowable is that everyone around her profited from maintaining the belief. Every unexplained noise justified another modification. Every unsettling sensation validated another wall, another staircase, another room. Fear did not lower the value of this property. It removed limits. The house became a closed economic loop. Belief generated work. Work reinforced belief, and no external verification interrupted the cycle. This was not a traditional haunted house scam. There was no sudden transfer of ownership. Instead, it reveals a different mechanism, a self-sustaining system where belief was exploited indirectly. No one needed to invent ghosts. They only needed to agree not to challenge them. The Winchester house shows what happens when fear does not devalue property, but monopolizes it. It became unsellable not because it was haunted, but because it was unfinished by design. The haunting was no longer a tactic, it was infrastructure. And once fear becomes infrastructure, it stops being a rumor. It becomes policy. This case matters because it marks a transition. Hauntings were no longer just tools to move property. They were becoming permanent narratives. Narratives that could sustain entire industries without a single lie needing to be proven. By the end of the 19th century, this logic was no longer isolated. It was about to scale, and fear was about to become a business model. By the late 19th century, haunted houses were no longer curiosities. They were assets. What had begun as isolated manipulations evolved into organized operations. Not performed by lone mediums or opportunistic buyers, but by coordinated groups with defined roles. Inherited estates were the primary targets. Large homes passed down through families were expensive to maintain and difficult to sell. Taxes were rising, neighborhoods were shifting, liquidity mattered more than legacy. Fear offered a solution. A single rumor could stall a sale. A confirmed séance could collapse negotiations entirely.
Once stigma attached, time worked in only one direction. Property values fell quietly. These operations followed a pattern. A medium introduced the narrative. A repairman installed subtle mechanisms. A lawyer ensured paperwork remained clean. A buyer waited. None of these actors needed to know the full plan. They only needed to perform their part. This fragmentation mattered. If questioned, no single person was responsible. The medium expressed belief. The contractor performed legitimate work. The lawyer handled legal transactions. Intent was distributed. Liability dissolved. Some groups operated across multiple cities. They maintained lists of cooperative mediums. They tracked newspaper editors willing to print unverified accounts. They monitored probate filings and inheritance records. Fear was deployed selectively. Not every house was haunted, only the ones that needed to be. By the 1890s, this process was repeatable. A house could be stigmatized, acquired, and rehabilitated within months. Once ownership changed, the haunting ended, the story faded, the value returned. This was not chaos, it was logistics. Fear moved through predictable channels. Media amplified it. Law ignored it. Markets responded to it. The result was a shadow economy. Homes were not traded on condition or location alone, but on narrative, and narratives could be engineered faster than repairs. What made this model durable was its deniability. No one advertised haunted house manipulation. No manuals were written. Everything operated through implication. And because belief was culturally acceptable, the system blended into normal commerce. By the turn of the century, fear had been fully integrated into real estate strategy. It was no longer superstition, it was leverage. By the 1920s, ghosts were losing credibility. Electric lighting replaced gas, plumbing modernized, science entered the home. Séances began to feel old-fashioned, ectoplasm became suspicious. The language of spirits no longer carried the same authority. So the scam adapted. Hauntings did not disappear, they were rebranded. The vocabulary changed first. Spirits became disturbances, possession became influence, voices became manifestations, and, most importantly, blame shifted. Instead of a ghost tied to the house, attention turned inward, to the occupants, a troubled adolescent, an unstable tenant, a sensitive child. Poltergeists became the explanation of choice. They were modern, psychological, difficult to disprove. This solved several problems at once. If activity occurred, it could be attributed to emotional stress. If it stopped, it was framed as recovery. If questioned, it was no longer supernatural, just misunderstood. Technology made the illusion easier. Hidden wires powered moving objects, magnets caused vibrations, electrical interference created flickering lights. These were not elaborate constructions, they were subtle enough to evade notice. And because electricity was still poorly understood by many homeowners, malfunctions felt ominous. Once again, suggestion did most of the work. A warning was issued, an expert was consulted, an explanation was offered without resolution. The house became unstable by association. This period marked an important shift. The haunting no longer needed a medium, it needed an explanation that sounded scientific enough to be plausible and vague enough to avoid testing. Real estate markets responded the same way they always had. Buyers hesitated, agents stalled, prices softened. The mechanics were unchanged. Fear still reduced demand. Reduced demand still created opportunity. What changed was presentation. The scam no longer leaned on belief in the dead. It leaned on uncertainty about the living. This made it harder to confront. You could dismiss a ghost. You could not easily dismiss behavior. And once a property was associated with instability, the stigma endured. The house did not need a story from the past, it only needed doubt in the present. By the end of the 1920s, the haunted house scam had survived another cultural transition, not by resisting modernity, but by absorbing it. Fear had learned to speak science. When the economy collapsed, the haunted house scam reversed direction. Fear was no longer a tool of investors. It became a weapon of survival. During the Great Depression, millions faced foreclosure. Banks moved quickly. Homes were seized on paper long before families left in reality. For some homeowners, there was no leverage left. No cash, no buyers, no negotiating power. So fear changed hands. Instead of devaluing property to acquire it, people devalued property to keep it. Rumors of disturbances began appearing around homes scheduled for repossession. Neighbors spoke of noises. Lights flickered. Objects moved. In some cases, families encouraged the stories. In others, they staged them. Banks were cautious. A stigmatized property was difficult to resell. A house associated with danger or instability slowed liquidation. Delay mattered. Every postponed auction bought time. Every abandoned inspection bought another month. Fear became equity. This was not organized crime, it was desperation. Families did not profit, they survived. The mechanics were familiar. A narrative attached to a location. Media amplified it. Legal ambiguity absorbed it. But the moral framing shifted. The same system that had extracted value from belief was now being used defensively. This revealed something critical. The haunted house scam did not belong to criminals or victims. It belonged to structure. Anyone under pressure could use it. As long as fear reduced certainty, it created friction, and friction slowed outcomes. By the late 1930s, banks adjusted. Policies hardened. Belief lost some power. But the lesson remained. Fear was flexible. It could flow toward profit or protection. It only needed stress to activate. And stress was about to return, in a new form, under a different name. After the Second World War, haunted houses did not disappear. They were standardized. The suburbs changed everything. Homes were no longer unique structures with long histories. They were mass-produced, uniform, interchangeable. This should have killed the scam. Instead, it refined it. In post-war America, the haunting no longer needed footsteps or voices. It only needed a fact, or the suggestion of one. A death, a suicide, an accident. Something that could not be disproven, but also did not require belief in spirits. In tightly packed suburbs, information moved quickly. Neighbors talked. Children repeated what they heard. Rumors traveled faster than inspections. A single whispered phrase could destabilize a listing. This house is different. Something happened there. You should ask before you buy. No séance was required. No medium was hired. The stigma was psychological, not supernatural. Developers learned how to use this. When a buyer backed out, the price dropped. When prices dropped, opportunities appeared. In some cases, developers quietly reacquired homes they had just sold. In others, they waited for panic to do the work. The process was subtle. No false statements, no explicit claims, only implication. A death might be real. The interpretation was not. This is where the scam became almost invisible. Because nothing illegal occurred. Deaths were not defects. History was not required to be disclosed, and emotional discomfort was not measurable. Once again, the law remained silent. The house itself was structurally identical to every other one on the street. Same layout, same materials, same utilities. Only the story differed, and stories affected price. This period produced a crucial shift. Hauntings no longer required belief in the paranormal. They required belief in contamination. The idea that events leave residue, that places remember. This belief fit perfectly into modern psychology. People did not fear ghosts, they feared proximity. The suburban haunted house scam worked because it was mundane. No flickering lights, no moving objects, just discomfort. And discomfort was enough. By the 1950s, fear had been fully normalized as a market signal. It did not need performance. It did not need spectacle. It only needed repetition. And once again, the system adapted without resistance, because it was no longer selling fear. It was selling hesitation. In the 1970s, the haunted house scam entered a new phase. It became scalable. The Amityville house was not just a property, it was a platform. A family moved in, a story emerged, and the media took over. What mattered was not whether the house was haunted. What mattered was the chain that followed. Interviews, book deals, legal filings, film rights. Each step reinforced the last. The original event was finite. The narrative was not. Financial pressure played a central role. Mortgage strain, legal costs, public scrutiny. Fear did not appear in isolation. It appeared alongside debt. Once the story reached print, the property itself became secondary. The house stopped functioning as real estate. It became intellectual property. The address was no longer valuable because of location or structure. It was valuable because of recognition. Ownership shifted meaning. The physical house lost resale value. The story gained it. Lawyers entered early. Contracts were drafted. Claims were formalized. Disputes over truth became irrelevant. Disputes over profit did not. Publishers advanced money. Producers optioned rights. The haunting was no longer an allegation. It was a brand. This marked a turning point. Fear no longer needed to devalue property to generate profit. It could bypass the market entirely. The house could fail as real estate and succeed as content. This altered incentives permanently. Stigma was no longer a problem to remove, it was an asset to protect. Contradictions were reframed as controversy. Skepticism became publicity. Every challenge strengthened attention. In this model, resolution was undesirable. An unresolved haunting could be monetized indefinitely. The Amityville case showed that the haunted house scam had evolved beyond transactions. It no longer needed buyers, it needed audiences. The mechanism remained familiar. Narrative replaced verification. Emotion replaced inspection. Repetition replaced proof. What changed was reach. Mass media eliminated geographic limits. A single address could affect millions, and once fear could be broadcast, it no longer belonged to a neighborhood. It belonged to the market. This was the moment hauntings stopped being local distortions and became national commodities. And the system learned something important. Fear did not need to collapse value. It could create a parallel economy instead. One where belief was no longer attached to ownership, only to attention. That lesson would not be forgotten.
By the 1980s, the system finally encountered resistance, not from skeptics, from buyers. Real estate disputes began reaching courts with a new argument, not structural damage, not fraud by inspection, but omission. Buyers claimed they were not told about a property's history, deaths, crimes, widely publicized hauntings. The houses were sound, the paperwork was clean, but the silence mattered. One New York case forced the issue into the open. A buyer purchased a brownstone that had been publicly described for years as haunted. The seller said nothing. The buyer later discovered the reputation. The court did something unprecedented. It acknowledged that belief could affect value, not because ghosts were real, but because reputation was. The ruling did not validate the haunting, it validated the market response to it. This created a new category in law,
stigmatized property, a property whose value is affected by psychological or reputational factors even when no physical defect exists. The implications were immediate. Some states required disclosure of deaths, others mandated disclosure of notorious events, a few addressed paranormal reputation directly, most did not. The law fractured along cultural lines. In some jurisdictions, silence remained legal. In others, it became risky. Disclosure laws were carefully limited. They did not require proof of haunting, only acknowledgement of known stigma. This preserved legal neutrality. The courts were not deciding what people should believe. They were recognizing how belief behaves economically. This mattered. For the first time, fear was acknowledged as a market force, not folklore, not superstition, but a variable. This did not end the haunted house scam, it formalized it. Once stigma had legal recognition, it became trackable, documented, searchable. The system adapted again. If fear had to be disclosed, it could be engineered earlier. If reputation followed the deed, it could be monetized before sale. The haunted house scam did not die in court. It learned the rules, and once rules exist, strategies follow. Fear had entered the contract, and contracts remember.
In the modern era, haunted houses no longer rely on age, they rely on infrastructure. The creaking floorboard has been replaced by the smart switch, the whispering wall by the Bluetooth speaker, the flickering gas lamp by the automated light. The mechanism is the same, only the tools have changed. Modern homes are dense with systems, electrical wiring, HVAC ducts, networked devices. Each introduces variables that most occupants do not fully understand, and uncertainty creates opportunity. Small disruptions feel intentional. Lights turn on without command. Music plays faintly from unknown sources. Thermostats change unexpectedly. The explanation does not need to be supernatural. It only needs to be unresolved. Technology allows distance. A disturbance can be triggered remotely, timed, repeated. No physical presence is required. This removes risk for the operator, and it multiplies plausibility for the observer. Because modern homes already behave unpredictably, software updates fail, connections drop, sensors misread. When a pattern forms, fear fills the gap. Some cases involve deliberate installation, hidden speakers behind walls, vibration devices near support beams, infrasound generators positioned to create unease. Others rely on misconfiguration, devices left intentionally unstable, access credentials shared quietly, automation routines altered subtly. The result is the same, a house that does not behave as expected. This does not create panic, it creates doubt, and doubt lowers confidence. Once confidence drops, attention shifts. Occupants monitor the home constantly. Every anomaly becomes evidence. Online communities amplify the effect. Videos are shared, comments speculate, belief spreads without verification. A haunted reputation can form in days, and once public, it cannot be easily reversed. This is where modern technology accelerates the scam. It compresses time. What once took months of rumor now takes a weekend of posts. And because devices generate data, the disturbances feel objective. Screenshots replace testimonies, logs replace memories, but interpretation still does the work. The house becomes unstable not because it is dangerous, but because it is unpredictable. In real estate, unpredictability is costly. Buyers hesitate, inspections slow, negotiations stall. Once again, fear does not need to be proven, it only needs to be persistent. This is the modern haunted house scam. No séances, no actors, no ghosts, just systems behaving badly in ways that feel intentional. And when technology becomes the source of fear, belief does not look irrational, it looks technical, which makes it harder to dismiss and easier to sell. Haunted houses did not return because of new evidence, they returned because of new formats. Reality television changed how fear was packaged. Shows framed investigations as process. Equipment replaced skepticism.
Repetition replaced proof. A location did not need confirmation, it needed episodes. Once a house appeared on screen, its status changed. It was no longer a rumor, it was content. Night vision footage implied access. Electronic meters implied measurement. Reaction shots implied discovery. None of this required validation. The structure of the show did the work. Each investigation followed the same arc: arrival, expectation, anomaly, suspense. Resolution was optional. This mattered for real estate. A property featured on television acquired a permanent tag. Search results preserved it. Clips circulated independently. References multiplied. Even skeptical coverage reinforced the association. The house was now known. This visibility had consequences. Owners reported increased inquiries, not from buyers, but from producers. Access fees were paid, permissions were negotiated. The property generated revenue without selling. For some owners, stigma became income. For others, it became a trap. Buyers hesitated. Insurers asked questions. Appraisals softened. The same exposure that created attention created friction. Reality TV did not invent haunted houses. It standardized them. It taught audiences what to look for, what counts as evidence, how fear should behave. This produced a feedback loop. Viewers learned the signs. They noticed them in their own homes. They shared experiences online. Suddenly, ordinary malfunctions fit a familiar script. The haunted house scam no longer needed operators. The audience performed the work. Media companies benefited from repetition. Properties absorbed the cost. What began as entertainment reshaped market perception. A house did not need a history, it needed airtime. Once filmed, the stigma persisted. This is the modern multiplier. Fear no longer required proximity, it required distribution, and distribution was endless. The system had changed again, not by inventing new tricks, but by outsourcing belief. The camera did not prove the haunting, it made it permanent.
As haunted houses moved from rumor to reputation, a darker incentive emerged: insurance. Policies are written for damage, disruption, and distress. They rely on claims being difficult to fabricate and expensive to verify. Fear exploited that gap. In several documented cases, homeowners reported unexplained destruction: scratches on walls, broken fixtures, damaged foundations. The cause was framed carefully: not vandalism, not neglect, unidentified disturbance. Adjusters faced a problem. There was no clear evidence of fraud, but there was also no clear explanation. Claims were filed for structural damage, for loss of use, for emotional distress tied to uninhabitable conditions. In some jurisdictions, insurers paid simply to close the file. The alternative was investigation, and investigation required proving intent. Fear complicated that. If a homeowner believed the disturbance was real, fraud was difficult to establish. Some cases escalated. Exorcisms were documented. Specialists were hired. Repair estimates ballooned. Each step reinforced the claim. The house was no longer normal. It required intervention. This blurred the line between belief and strategy. In a few instances, investigations revealed patterns: damage that appeared only when no one was present, devices installed where they should not be, neighbors reporting nothing unusual. But proving orchestration was rare. Insurance law depends on evidence. Fear leaves impressions, not fingerprints. The system responded cautiously. Policies added exclusions, mental distress clauses tightened, claims were delayed, not denied. This created a new tension. Homeowners under financial pressure discovered a loophole. Insurers discovered ambiguity. Neither side wanted a public test case. Quiet settlements became common.
The haunted house scam had found another channel. Not resale, not stigma, reimbursement. Fear now moved money without transferring ownership. This marked a significant evolution. The haunted house no longer depended on market reaction. It depended on institutional risk management. Insurance companies priced fear statistically, not emotionally. And once fear entered actuarial models, it became normalized. The haunted house was no longer folklore. It was a category, a risk profile. And like all risk profiles, it invited manipulation. This was no longer a story about belief. It was about systems struggling to quantify it. And systems rarely succeed on the first attempt.
Fear does not travel alone. It adapts. Across cultures, the haunted house scam appears under different names, but the structure remains intact. In East Asia, the language is not ghosts, it is imbalance. Properties are labeled unlucky. Energy is misaligned. Orientation is wrong. A nearby structure casts a harmful shadow. A previous occupant died improperly. The flow is blocked. The result is the same. Buyers hesitate, prices soften, opportunities emerge. In Hong Kong, apartments associated with death or misfortune are marked implicitly. Listings avoid certain numbers, floors are skipped, prices adjust without explanation. Nothing supernatural is claimed, everything is implied. In parts of the Middle East, fear takes another form. Properties are rumored to be occupied by jinn, invisible entities tied to place, not people. The language is careful. No one claims to see them, only to feel presence. This creates deniability. A house is avoided not because it is dangerous, but because it is unpredictable. In North Africa and the Caribbean, similar patterns emerge through curses, spirits, or ritual contamination. A property becomes associated with an event. The event becomes inseparable from the location. In each case, belief is localized, but the economics are universal. Stigma lowers demand. Lower demand lowers price, and someone is always prepared to buy at a discount. What differs is not the mechanism, it is the vocabulary. Con artists do not introduce new fears, they borrow existing ones. They speak the language people already trust. This is why the scam persists globally. It does not require export, it requires translation. A haunted house in one culture is an unbalanced home in another. The paperwork changes, the belief does not. Legal systems struggle similarly. Most jurisdictions do not require disclosure of intangible stigma. Reputation exists outside the contract. This preserves ambiguity, and ambiguity is exploitable. The global haunted house scam does not rely on ghosts, it relies on consensus. Once enough people believe a place is compromised, the market responds accordingly. No evidence is required, only repetition. This is the final form of the scam's expansion. It is no longer tied to a specific era or a specific belief system. It is portable. As long as humans associate meaning with space, space can be manipulated. Fear is not cultural noise, it is cultural infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, is difficult to dismantle. In the next movement, we turn the lens forward, because the future of this scam does not depend on houses at all. It depends on how fear is packaged next.
By the time a house is labeled haunted, the damage has already occurred. But the mechanisms that create that label leave traces. Every manufactured haunting depends on omission, timing, and distance between facts. The first place to look is the paper trail. Property records do not tell stories, they tell sequences. Rapid transfers at irregular prices are a warning sign. So are short ownership periods followed by sudden resale. Fear often appears between transactions, not during them. Next is the timeline. Hauntings rarely begin immediately after purchase. They emerge after stress points, a failed sale, an upcoming foreclosure, a disputed inheritance. Context matters more than claims.
Architecture provides another layer. Certain features recur: hollow walls, unfinished crawl spaces, shared ducts between rooms. These are not defects, they are amplifiers. Sound travels where attention is already focused. Old plumbing knocks predictably. Heating systems expand and contract. Infrasound emerges from wind, traffic, or machinery. When disturbances match infrastructure cycles, fear is being interpreted, not experienced. Media history is equally revealing. Old newspaper archives show how reputations form. A single article is often enough. Later reports rarely investigate, they cite the first. Online, the pattern accelerates. Posts are shared, comments speculate, assumptions harden. A house becomes haunted because it is described that way often enough. Professional involvement is another indicator. Mediums, investigators, contractors, or producers appearing early in the timeline suggest orchestration. Legitimate belief does not require coordination. Scams do. Financial beneficiaries should be identified. Who gains if the property's value drops? Who benefits if it becomes unsellable? Who profits if the story spreads? The answer is rarely the house itself. Finally, consider resolution. Authentic tragedies leave records. Manufactured hauntings fade when ownership changes. If activity stops abruptly after a sale, the cause was likely economic. Auditing a haunting does not require skepticism. It requires structure. The question is not whether something was felt, it is whether the feeling served a purpose. Fear always moves toward utility. If it creates leverage, it will be used. The tools to see this now exist. Archives are searchable. Records are public. Patterns repeat. What was once invisible can be mapped. And once mapped, the story changes. Not because belief disappears, but because belief is no longer alone. It is placed beside evidence. And evidence reshapes the market.
It has always been about stories. Stories attach meaning to space. They turn buildings into symbols. They convert fear into value, and value into leverage. From gas-lit parlors to digital dashboards, the mechanism has remained intact. Only the medium has changed. A house does not need to be unsafe to become undesirable. It does not need to be damaged to become discounted. It only needs a narrative that cannot be easily resolved. Once fear enters a property's history, it lingers. Even when activity stops, even when ownership changes, even when explanations are offered. Because markets do not trade on certainty, they trade on perception. This is why haunted houses persist, even as belief systems evolve. Spirits gave way to phenomena. Phenomena gave way to psychology. Psychology gave way to technology. At each stage, fear adapted without losing function. The haunted house scam survived because it never depended on superstition. It depended on plausibility, on the discomfort of not knowing, on the risk of being wrong, on the cost of ignoring warning signs. In modern markets, this dynamic is accelerating. Virtual property carries no physical defects, yet reputation still matters. Digital spaces can be stigmatized. Experiences can be labeled unsafe. Fear no longer needs walls, it needs interfaces. As ownership becomes abstract, narratives become more powerful. A house once stood between land and belief. Now belief moves freely, detached from location. But the principle remains. The most valuable thing in any transaction is not the asset. It is the story attached to it. And the most dangerous purchase is not a broken structure. It is an unresolved narrative. The haunted house scam does not end because it does not belong to a time period. It belongs to a pattern. As long as humans assign meaning to space, space can be manipulated. As long as fear reduces certainty, certainty can be priced. The house is always listed.
The question is never whether the ghost is real. The question is whether you are buying a home or inheriting a story designed to move you. Because once fear is written into a deed, it does not need to appear again. It has already done its work.